Adit, thank you so much for coming to meet with us. Um, Even though I'm older and maybe wiser than you, I have learned so much about research from you too, and I'm hoping that you can help us teach other people how to get grants and build research careers that they envision for themselves.
Excited to dig in.
Thank you. Thank you. So, one of the things that Joe and I've been starting with is when you think about grant writing, part of it is writing, getting words on a page, and you're quite prolific and you mentor lots of other writers. Are there any tips or tricks you have for people about how you get words specifically focused on grants, not manuscripts too, but we're okay to hear about that too.
Yeah, I think one, you got to be passionate about the topic. So I think people that have blank page syndrome, where you're just staring and thinking and feeling the writer's block, sometimes it is they're in the wrong topic area. So you got to already start by being passionate about the area. And then I like to read first before writing. So I get inspiration by rereading or reading for the first time some pivotal articles in the space. I'm still a handwritten note type of person. So writing down some notes and then anchoring that gets you in the right space. Then I think dividing it up into chunks, because you can look at, a grant application and see this, huge amount that you need to do. So, focus on a section, and maybe you're in the mood to write a background and significance today, or maybe today is the day for method. So you just have your list, your checklist, and you can approach the day, okay, I have a half day today. What do I want to focus on? Let me see what's here. There's some things that have some urgency, some time frame. So, those are the things to tackle first. Sometimes maybe, you've been working clinically or things are going on at home, totally burned out. And so maybe today's the day to write letters or draft letters for people. So I think, balancing priority, figuring out what needs to be done, and then bringing it into manageable chunks. Then, especially at the beginning, having enough time carved out to write. 1 hour, 2 hours is just not enough to get in the zone. Mm-hmm. So I think you need, whatever works for individuals, but I like to recommend at least 4-hour blocks, especially if you're doing new primary writing, to be able to fully dive into the headspace, get some momentum.
I agree with that. I'm so impressed by people who, maybe they use a Pomodoro timer and they say, I'm going to write for 20-minute chunks or whatever. That does not work for me. Yeah. I have to really give myself permission to get in the zone. And I mean, you have young kids, and I check, did anybody call from school? Is everybody okay? I sort of make the rounds of make sure everybody's where they need to be. And then I can feel safe turning off the ringer. I usually just use airplane mode, close the email account, make sure I have everything out that I need, and then go just get into it. So I also consider, I would say 3 hours would be my minimum block to actually put words on a page, but 4 would be better.
Yeah, I think that, shutting down the distractions is really important. The other thing is that you want to get into creative headspace. Sometimes your creativity goes into a little bit tangential directions for the task at hand. So having somewhere to put that, and sometimes it's, often, hopefully it's related to what you're writing, but maybe not the section you're writing today. So then kind of having some place to put those ideas, or sometimes I'll, if you're in a document, you have it shelled out, you can go to that section and just jot those couple triggers. Like, don't write prose, but have a couple bullet points where you're like, oh, I've got this great idea for the methods. Let me just jot that down real quick. You don't want to lose it. And then if you don't have a place to dump it, then you perseverate on it and it becomes a distraction. So ability to move distractions, whether it's related to to what you're writing or not, to somewhere to store it. It's sort of like, the notepad at the bedside table. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of ideas come, an hour before falling asleep or in the shower or wherever, people tend to think clearly. And so having a place to put those ideas when maybe it's not the moment to pull out the laptop is helpful.
So you like coming into that allotted 4-hour or 3-hour block of time already with your thoughts a little more organized than just like showing up after dealing with kids and other types of stuff, clinic and all that. So you like to have like notes, maybe separate it and then show up to your block period of time ready to roll, like actually write down, like expand on those?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think part of that goes to the setup. So one of the sessions, perhaps preliminary to the hardcore writing, is setting yourself up. So figuring out what sections you need to write. If you don't know the instructions, because some of these mechanisms are different, or maybe it's your first grant, it takes time digging into the instructions. You should do that up front before you actually start the writing, because the worst thing in the world is to write something and then realize it's not exactly what you were supposed to be writing and then have to do it again.
Yeah.
So do that prep work, do some of the preliminary reading, taking notes, whatever it is to set up for the writing. So those are some sessions before you even start the hardcore writing.
I agree with that. And even in a manuscript, right? When you know the article type you're writing and you know very specifically, like if the abstract is supposed to have a certain shape, or you have 5 tables and figures, like what will they be? You do a little bit of that, like you read the author's instructions. You really make a plan in that same block, because it is advancing your writing, because you want to spend the hard work doing the thing that's going to work, right?
For sure. And I think part of that prep work also, as you're digesting what needs to be written, is you can shell things out. Manuscripts are pretty formulaic in that way, but when grant writing, there's different sections and then there's subsections of your sections. And so seeing that actually is a gimme to make the page not look blank anymore, right? So the worst thing is you're just starting from scratch and you're starting with your section header. But if you have it all mapped out, maybe you number your sections and give a decimal point to your subsections, all of a sudden it starts to seem more achievable, because you see it in the bigger context. You're just starting to write text, and you already, some people will put italicized instructions at the top of their section, or put a comment off that, has a little bit of instructions or triggers. So when you're like, what am I writing again today? Then you can actually see the trigger that's telling you what you should be doing.
I love that, because I also find we've heard some other researchers give the advice, basically, and I've been subject to this too. You go to you're writing your special 3 hours and you're like, where was that last document? Where are the instructions? And you're like, you're getting all disorganized. If you can lay that stuff in your prep work in the same document, there's no getting away from your document, right? It keeps you in play the whole time. And that what that does, which always helped me, is it helps me visualize just how much space I've allocated for this section, because sometimes they'll say one paragraph, half a page. Sometimes they won't say, but you have to divvy it up yourself, and you're like, well, let's see, this needs 2 pages, this needs 1 page, this leaves me with a half page here.
Right.
So then it helps you gauge what you're doing.
Yeah, that's really helpful as well. I think part of it for me is just figuring out ways to get momentum quickly, because especially, so say you have a Dr. Libby 3-hour block. It's a precious 3 hours. It can take an hour just to get momentum. So what do you do to decrease that, to be able to be in the zone in 5 minutes? So some of it is the prep work. Another thing that I'll do is when I'm at the end of a writing session, to start writing the next thing that I'm going to do the next writing session, because you're already in the zone, right? Mm-hmm. So then instead of saying like, okay, here's the next section, it's blank right now, maybe I have a header and some instructions, actually write the first sentence or 2, or I'll jot a few bullet points down, because I'm already warmed up to take the last 10 minutes of your writing session to set yourself up for the next writing session. So those are,
That's brilliant.
Yeah, that sounds like it could really help some young writers out. And when you are starting that new paragraph or new page, we've heard from previous people that they'll go to mentors to see if they're starting with the right question, or do you have any strategies to not waste that next page when you come back and you have a whole different idea, or like you're in a different headspace? Is there any way or any strategy you use to continue to stay in that same zone that you were in when you wrote the first page?
Yeah, I think it's less of a headspace thing and maybe more of a strategy thing related to being on target with the writing. And I think one thing we haven't talked about yet is making sure you have really great examples of what it is you're trying to write. So that is, you can definitely leverage mentors and mentorship team. Also, find people that are writing similar things. So sort of the peer mentor, or the, just somebody who's in the same zone. We don't have to call it a mentor. But you're kind of doing things together. So you have something to bounce ideas off of. Mentors can help. You also don't want to bother mentors with things that might be gettable yourself, or at least that you could try yourself too. So it's a little bit of a balance. Mentors don't want you spending hours wasted spinning your wheels, but also there's an expectation that, they can set the course and you can figure it out. But, leaning on good examples of writing, because, grants can be, even if it's a different topic, you can learn a lot from seeing successful grant applications. So if you find those good examples, ideally of a mechanism that's the same or similar to what you're writing, especially if it was well received, that just gives you a good sense of what they're looking for and the type of writing and the level of depth and the amount of space you should take up. So some of those things, if you have a few examples and they're all pretty similar in that, then you're like, okay, now I have a sense of what I need to do with this section or this page.
That is actually really good advice. I guess one thing
I
just
learned it from you.
very sweet. I think one way you could get examples is ask your mentor if they have any former grants, or have they reviewed grants, they've seen something they really like. They could go and look for funded grants, and you can always ask somebody for a grant, right?
Yeah.
Like they can say no, but often they say yes, especially if you just ask for a certain section. And oftentimes people are so generous, they'll give you their whole grant. So yes, getting examples. And then, what I was thinking about is I've heard some people say, well, I was mentored by David McCullough, or I was mentored by Ernest Hemingway. I mean, the man isn't alive anymore, but if you are a student of a particular author's writing, you can be mentored by them by watching their patterns, watching how they write, and, learn.
Yeah.
And in the same way, I love if you're, when you read research writing, it helps you with the tone, with how much space they spend on different sections, with how detailed they get and when. I mean, that is mentorship, even if you don't know the team. Right?
I mean, it's an art form. So you are learning the craft. Sometimes that's verbal, and sometimes that's, in a way, a self-study. So I think that, learning from those that you don't necessarily even have contact with in that way is good. And I agree, going back to your point, people should not feel shy about asking for even strangers. Sometimes you might look it up, it's publicly available. Oh, here are the people that were funded by this mechanism last year, or the last 5 years, or whatever. Something kind of rings out, then reach out. People want to, one, showcase their work. It's flattering to be reached out to and ask for examples. Sometimes it's proprietary information, or it's in progress and, people don't feel comfortable, and it's not personal. But most of the time, 90% of the time, people will give something very useful, if not the whole thing.
Yes. And I guess we should probably say, if you young person, is going to go reach out to somebody who's been funded, you don't send an email and say, can you send me your grant? Like, you've never talked to this person. They don't know you or trust you with their things, whatever. You would ask if you could have a short conversation with them and ask them questions about how they got funded and how they did it. And if it goes well, then you might say, would you be willing to share part of this grant? Or do you have any other advice?
Yeah, no, I think that's, you don't want to, it's like a first date type of thing.
Right.
Too
much,
exactly.
right?
The other thing is, this is an area to engage your mentor in. So, or mentorship team. So your mentors will have a lot of, people they've mentored or colleagues that likely, if they're your mentors, somewhat in the space that's relevant, hopefully, for your work. So it's pretty easy for them to call in a favor too. So sometimes, it can be a little bit of a bar to get busy people to even have that brief meeting if you're on your own. So either a warm handoff or them just making the ask on your behalf can sometimes get some things quickly. Again, you don't want to overuse that card. But, if there's some world famous person, it might be probably too much for you to go directly to that person. And maybe, ideally if someone, like a mentor knows that person, then that's the way to work the angle. It's a good use of mentor network.
Yeah. So as someone who's seen grants, and both of you, lots of grants come through, lots get accepted, lots get rejected. What have you seen that has been a common characteristic when it comes to a team or a person or something about them, or just honestly anything that you've noticed when it comes to this is more likely to be successful? Have you noticed anything specific?
So I think a couple things come to mind immediately, and then we can, I'm sure, riff a little bit. The first is knowing your audience and your sponsor. So I think, you could have the most breathtaking science, and if you don't know what the funder wants, what their ethos is, this is stylistic, but it's also what they care about. That's how you got to get inside their head and then speak to them as if you were having a conversation about, what they're after. Why would you, entrust these funds to this person, right? So you got to inspire them. And then that comes through in the writing. So if you have that level of understanding, and most of that is publicly available. Sometimes it's getting to the sponsor, other people that knows the sponsor. So that is the same science to a different audience, could look fairly different, even though it's the same science.
Right.
Another that we frequently talk about is just being persistent. So, it's a number one predictor of success in academics is to not give up. Starting in the first place, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. You've got to try. It may look hard or daunting, or you may say, oh, there's only a 10% chance of getting this. I'm not even going to try. You can guarantee it's 0% if you don't try.
Right.
And then not being, this field is full of rejection. You got to get over it.
So I've heard.
That's just part of the game. That's what we've signed up for. And the people that are left standing at the end are the ones that brush off the rejection, actually take the best of, the critiques, and then move on and figure out the next path forward with their team. And so I think, those are two, I'm sure there's many others. Those are the two that come to mind initially about common characteristics of successful.
Yeah, I totally agree, Adit. There are some people who are, looking for the easy grant, and there are no easy grants.
Yeah.
Like, there are some that you probably have better odds than not, but, because funding is so limited, almost always, there are beautiful, fine, important grants that don't get funded. So first of all, not getting funded is not a rejection of everything. I mean, my goodness, we have lines that are like 8% lines. I mean, the 9% grant is probably almost flawless, right? So some of that is just luck of the draw. And some of it is timing and priorities. I mean, I remember back in the day, I was a postdoc. This was very formative. There was a team from our research center, was a UCSF team doing schizophrenia research. They got a 1.0, a perfect score on a grant, and they were not funded. So after you get scored, then you get stacked up with everybody else, and then the agency talks about priorities, and that was not going to make the cut because even though it was beautiful, it was not one of their top priorities. And so you just, sometimes that works in your favor, and you get picked out maybe lower than you would have otherwise, and you go, that's so great. But then sometimes you get picked over, and I think you have to be like,
just rise above it.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Can we talk about scoring a little bit? Because we haven't talked about this yet.
Sure, yeah.
And I remember growing up watching her writing a ton of grants, and I remember she would come back and be like, I got a 43. or like these scores.
I can imagine the hand motion.
And I'm just like, I don't know what that means, but like, let's go. And then you'd get rejected.
43 would be bad.
I don't remember the number.
Yeah.
But what does that mean? Is it the same across all grants? Like, how important is it when it comes to, because you just said a perfect score doesn't really mean much.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good, but it doesn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's very sponsor dependent in that way. So, NIH, which is a world that we live a lot in the medical school and medical research, they have a defined scoring rubric across. And for them, lower score is better. It's golf scoring. And it's changed a few times over the years. And so that, if you're submitting an NIH grant, you can feel reasonably comfortable in what those scores mean. Now, even within NIH, a certain score could be funded on some mechanism, and double that score could be funded on a different mechanism. So it depends on sort of what the pay lines are. So there's certain cutoffs. And then, as Anne was mentioning earlier, sometimes it's programmatic preference. Little less common in NIH, very common in other areas of funding. Okay. And then other types of scoring system, it could be higher is better. And so, usually they'll have a rubric that they publish or that they can be available. Sometimes they will tell you what a pay line is or what an anticipated, meaning like if you score better than this, you will get funded. You have a good chance of being funded. If you score worse than this, you are unlikely to be funded. And then often there's a gray zone where they can pick, this might have been not quite where we wanted it, but the science is really important or it addresses an unmet need or something like that, and then they can pick it.
So how much attention do you pay attention to that, or do you tell your mentees to pay attention to that?
That comes after submission.
Okay.
So after submission, once we celebrate submission, you all just celebrate your submissions.
Okay.
Because it's a huge amount of work. And the dust settles, and it's, okay, what do we expect and when do we expect it? It's not even something to worry about during submission. You should understand the scoring rubric in terms of the things that they're evaluating you on, but when you get your score, what your score will look like, then it's, okay, in 4 months on this website, this blank is going to have a number.
And you try not to log in every day. Right? You're like,
don't even look until this date.
Yes.
After that, maybe a few times a week,
right.
Look at this. And the number, then you can say based on the past, this number, you can divide it into that likely funded gray zone, unlikely to be funded based if you know that sponsor or, and so then you just kind of, that's in the waiting game time frame, but it's not really something to perseverate on during writing.
I know that sometimes you have submitted grants multiple times. And so have you ever seen moments where someone submits a grant that they're confident about, it gets a bad score, and then they just give up on it because, or where you think they should have kept pushing and being persistent?
All the time. It's actually worse than that.
Oh.
Not only do they give up on that grant, they could give up on their research career. And that's for somebody who's well-trained or has good ideas or talented. That's a travesty. And so that there's persistence with an idea, and then there's persistence in the career choice. And sometimes, after trying many times, it may not be the right path. That's okay. But 1 or 2 rejections, it's join the club. I mean, if you get funded early on, then you're one of the fortunate few. But it's the people that keep trying. Or, sometimes an idea is, quote, dead on arrival. And you can get that feedback and you can see the writing on the wall. So then it's, how do I take that and move it into something that is fundable, or move it to a different sponsor that it's better aligned with? Because sometimes it's not the science, it's the alignment with what the sponsor's interested in.
Yes, and let me build on that, because I will say, I think back to my own career, and my first couple or 3 grants were funded. And I thought, I got this whole business figured out. This is a great gig. I know how to write a grant. I'm always going to be funded. And then I got a few misses. And I think as we mentor people, sometimes somebody will hit, their grant will hit right away, their career development award, that major funding to kick off. And I think, I kind of wish they had been rejected one time, right, because they didn't really get the practice of burning through a rejection. And I think this is going to come it will come.
Yeah.
Rejection always comes, and it's going to come at a stage where they think they're invincible.
The world is going to end at that
right,
point.
And it's going to be shattering, and that is really hard. So, what you want is the rejection that it will set you back on your heels, and you have the support to, do your stages of grief and, work through it and get constructive, but get back there instead of completely giving up, shutting down, leaving the field. These would be very sad.
Yeah, I mean, this is about building resilience in a physical way. It's about building a callus. And this is probably what, Anne is talking about, which is if you really haven't sort of gotten in the dirt and gotten those hands, messy and cut up a little bit, when that happens at a later stage, it's going to hurt a lot.
Yeah.
But if, you've built up that toughness, then you're well equipped to move on to the next steps.
Considering you've had a long, successful career, what do you view as your hardest challenge in research?
Adit has had a shocking breadth of research topics, which we wouldn't, many things that Adit has achieved, we would not recommend for other people. Okay, so like some things are just like Adit only, asterisks, and then there's the rest of us. Some of the kinds of studies you've gotten funded are things that are really like high challenge studies. Like I would say community consent is like, people are afraid to do those kind of studies, and Adit's like, let's do it, let's get in there. So could you talk, because that, for anybody, and even you, would find that a challenge. Can you talk about working through deciding to do something that would be viewed by many as risky, probably getting rejected a little bit? Can you talk us through how you kept at it and now you're like the guy who knows how to do that study?
Thank you for that. I think that it's stage dependent, right? You got to push yourself. If you get in too much of a comfort zone, it's just not fun anymore, right? Even if you can go from grant to grant and such. This may be my personal opinion. Some people might like that.
I did asterisk.
Exactly.
So you want to take on new challenges. And, in these contexts, the work has to be done, right? And it's sort of, our boss will sometimes say, if it was easy, anyone could do it, right? So you should push yourself. You have the ability, you have the team. So some of this is building up your team too. Once you get further along in this career, you're not doing any of this alone. You're getting to be with great people, whether they're scientists or staff members, and they're helping you do this work together. And so then you want to tackle, because public health needs it, the world needs it, and there's fewer and fewer people when you get to these challenging areas that can actually tackle and do the work. Does that make life miserable sometimes? Yes, because it's really hard. And it's at the end becomes even more gratifying because you feel like you are one of few people that can actually accomplish this task, which then has, hopefully an impact on human health in this standpoint.
So do you mind explaining, because I think some of what I tell Joe about is like, oh, this study, listen to this. And he wants to know, what does that mean? Like, what do those studies mean? Why would you choose that design, whatever? And obviously we're not going to do a whole expo on methods, but I think community consent is quite fascinating. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so I think, I'm an emergency medicine physician. And so we do acute and critical care research. And these are conditions where patients come in extremis with life-threatening illness or injury. We need to know how to care for these patients, and there's actually a pretty limited amount of evidence. It's really hard to do research when you have seconds or minutes and a patient is, dying of bleeding or have a life-threatening infection.
Or unconscious, not able to respond to you.
Usually almost goes without saying in this context is that they're, either not conscious or in so much distress that there's no way that you would have the time or ability to say, let's sit down. I know you're dying, but let's sit down and talk about this research study that might help you. It's just not a thing. So one choice could be, we have a lot of smart people taking care of these patients. Let's just ask them how we care for these patients, and we'll figure out the best way to care for them just by consensus. And what we know time and time again is that consensus is not often the right approach. That's based on hand-me-down information. It's based on serial anecdotes. So we need to be able to do research in this challenging context. And so there are now, for the last few decades, the ability to, instead of consenting the patient, you do a process called exception from informed consent, or EFIC, where you do community consultation and then public disclosure. So community consultation is essentially the same as consenting the community. So you go out into the community and try to, address those that might have the condition you're interested in. So we, did this in the past on a traumatic brain injury. And so, we looked at bicycle clubs and motorcycle clubs and those that in older adults, which often can have devastating head injuries, and went out in those communities and talked about the research that we were doing and got feedback on, here's what we're doing. Does this generally seem acceptable? What about this doesn't work? So you get input on the design, and then the public disclosure piece, essentially after and if you have that this is generally acceptable to your community, then you have an obligation as best you can to get the word out to the public to say, hey, we're doing, for the next 2 to 3 years, we're doing this study in our community. There's obviously a lot of ethical oversight and other things. If you happen to have a traumatic brain injury, and you come to our hospital, you might be enrolled. If you do not wish to have this happen, here is how you opt out of the study in advance. So you get a bracelet, you get put in a registry, and you have to look that up before you enroll somebody in the study. So it's a unique way of being able to do research, and something that can take many, many months to go first through the regulatory process and then through the process of engaging the community and then doing the public disclosure activities. But then at the end of it, your startup timeline may be longer. Then you actually get to do, research that could change the way we care for these patients. And often we're in a zone where, small beneficial changes could actually yield a very positive result, because, maybe without another treatment, they might have a 50% chance of dying. So if you could do a little something to improve their course, and you knock that down to 40%, you will have saved, thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives.
That was fascinating.
It's cool.
That was so interesting.
Right. And that's what you do when you're really, really good, and
Yeah,
you're like,
that was-
this is all the regular stuff's a little bit slow. Let's take on a new challenge. And don't we all benefit from it? Yes, we do.
Yeah, and how do you even find time to do that when you're actually in the clinic? Just like, as you said, you have these people coming in minutes, seconds, and then you're doing this whole other overarching project with the community and public consent. Do you ever struggle to figure that out?
So, there's the career aspect of it, which you have to find your work balance, right?
Yeah.
There's only 24 hours in a day and 168 hours in a week. I tend to use a lot of those hours, but that's okay. And so you have to figure out how to spend your time. And so, in medical research as physician scientists, often we're balancing how much time we spend in the clinic to how much time we're doing research or other academic activities, and figuring out that balance. In the moment, in caring for the patient, one, there's a research team that's separate than the clinical team typically. And then essentially you are figuring out a way to choreograph the research around the care of the patient. You never want to interfere, obviously, with the care of the patient. And you would like to be able to layer this on, and you may only have, 20 minutes to do it.
Right. And to build off what you said earlier, once you do these kinds of studies, this isn't like one man, one paper. You have a whole team of people, and that becomes the next great challenge is you have to mobilize these other people to execute your wishes.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you're an executive and you're a manager and you're the scientist proposing and writing these grants, but it becomes quite an enterprise. But it must be how it happens. Like you have to multiply yourself. Even if it would take 6 people to be one Adit, conservatively speaking, you need those 6 people, right?
Yeah, I think that as you are applying and asking organizations for funding, what you're trying to do is to build your small business of research in your topic area. So then, you become a manager of that small business and you find the right people to partner with or to employ to help execute on the vision, because you can't do it all yourself. And then you have to think about what is the highest use of your time as the PI of this project, the PI of this lab or group, which is, what we're striving to do when we're writing these grant applications. At the beginning, in the early career, you're doing everything. You're writing the grant, you're executing the work. If you're fortunate, you can hire a person to roll up their sleeves along with them to be able to do that. As things progress, then the highest order of your time is actually not necessarily enrolling patients and collecting data. It is perhaps having high conversations with the critical barriers of the project to set it off on the right foot, and then pivoting to the next project to be able to think about the science and to get funding for that, and then circling back, figuring out where the holes are, where the challenge and the pressure points are, and then managing the people and the team that are executing on the vision.
So when you have one of these big overarching ideas and you're trying to choose the best team you possibly can, when young researchers are coming in, how do they put themselves in the spotlight for someone like you when you're trying to find a team? Like, what can they do to make themselves stand out?
I think that's more of that question is around generally marketing from a mentee standpoint, which I think is really important. I would say, be prepared, do your homework.
What does that mean when you say that?
So I think, so say there is someone that you think would be a great person to work with as a mentor. That person is likely very busy with their own research, and they're likely very busy as a mentor because they're good and desirable in terms of building careers. And so, one, you're asking for favor in a way. And two, you're trying to inspire that person to take some of their limited bandwidth and dedicate to investing it in you as a person, right? So you doing your homework means knowing what that person has done and where they're coming from, knowing, potentially things about their science and their lab and their structure, and then figuring out how what you're interested in plugs into that construct, and kind of demonstrating how it's hard to be an asset necessarily, but at least how it will be enjoyable to work with you, that it's not going to be, because it's still work. Even if you manage up, like we recommend most mentees do with their mentor, and get a lot of the work done for the mentor to be able to help them, it's still work for the mentor. So you got to minimize that and then make it a joy. And sometimes it's, a match and a personality thing, but sometimes it's just, making, it's not that different than applying for a job in a way. You want to try and highlight the match aspects of it, why you're interested, why it's a good fit, how you're going to be, a good person to join the team and that sort of thing.
I guess I'll build on that. Sometimes I think, especially if you're looking at a super senior mentor like Adit, or, I remember Tom Check came out here and gave, a lecture. He's Nobel laureate from Boulder. And it's like, okay, you're approaching Tom Check and he's like, you got a new idea for the guy, whatever. Nevertheless, new people, new ideas, different experiences, like all this fresh, there's a lot that fresh eyes brings, period. And if you approach it not like, well, how will I fit into your lab, but rather, I saw this thing you did and what it made me think about was la, la, la. You're almost trying to show that you can understand what they did and just have different approaches, different ideas, that you're just thinking and you're creating and you're trying to add to it, even if they're like, yeah, I thought about that 20 years ago. Okay, great. We're thinking along the same lines, right? Like that. And then I think the other signal is, are you someone who is reliable and is going to be able to follow through? I think accomplishment is a huge deal, which is why everybody loves grants and pubs, right? It's the ultimate accountability. You had an idea, you executed on the idea, you finish the stinking thing, because you know you're going to get rejected, and it means you're going to face up rejection. You're going to get back in there, and it's going to be done. And just that simple A to Z action, it really separates you from other people. It's pretty surprising. And didn't I interview all kinds of people? Yeah. It's like that. It says so much, so much.
Yeah, I mean, you want people who can be responsive and be able to see things through to completion, demonstrate that. And then sometimes, depending on the circumstance, we'll give people small things that they might, if it's a student, say, for instance, why don't you, write down that idea, send me a paragraph on that, and you'd be surprised, 90% never show back up again. So from a mentor standpoint, you don't want to waste your time.
Yeah.
So,
right, if
somebody not following through,
is going to not send you over. Okay.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this is real. And it's just like, you want to feel like if you're giving effort, they're giving effort, right? You're sort of matching, because it's a gift.
Or 90-10.
95, right?
Yeah.
Right. This is so helpful, Adit.